a ruler came to Cajamarca with enough power behind him to shake the mountains. He came as the victor of a civil war. He came as a son of the Empire of the Sun. He came surrounded by nobles, attendants, warriors, ritual confidence, and the weight of one of the largest states in the world. Waiting for him inside the town were fewer than 200 Spaniards. Not 2,000. Not 20,000. Fewer than 200. They were exhausted, isolated, deep in unfamiliar territory, and surrounded by an empire they barely understood. If numbers alone decided history, they should have vanished in a single afternoon. Instead, they captured the emperor. And with that one act, the Inca Empire discovered a terrifying weakness hidden inside its own greatness. When power is built around one sacred ruler, the capture of that ruler can become the capture of the state's nervous system. Welcome to the History Docket, where history's greatest disasters are reopened. Before we enter Cajamarca, take a moment to like this episode, subscribe to the channel, and leave your verdict in the comments as the case unfolds. Because this story is often told too simply. Steel defeated stone, horses defeated foot soldiers, Europe defeated the Andes. But the real case is more unsettling. It is about civil war, sacred kingship, intelligence failure, psychological shock, political misreading, local rivalries, and a trap so bold it almost feels impossible even after it happened. This is the capture of Atahualpa. The day a small band of invaders seized the most powerful man in the Andes. The meeting that became an ambush. The ransom that filled a room with gold and still could not buy a life. The empire that was not weak, but vulnerable in ways its enemies learned to exploit. And the disaster that began not with the fall of a capital, but with the silence after a royal litter was overturned in a plaza. Chapter 1: The Empire in the Mountains. The Inca Empire was not ancient in the way Egypt was ancient, or Rome was ancient, or China was ancient. It was young. And that youth matters. By the early 16th century, the empire known to its people as Tawantinsuyu, the realm of four parts, had expanded with extraordinary speed across the Andes. From its heartland around Cusco, it stretched over mountains, valleys, deserts, forests, and high plateaus. Its roads crossed impossible terrain. Its storehouses collected maize, potatoes, textiles, weapons, tools, and supplies. Its officials recorded obligations, goods, and labor through knots on quipu cords. Its armies marched across altitudes that would exhaust outsiders. Its rulers commanded a world organized through ritual, administration, kinship, conquest, and obligation. This was not a primitive society waiting to be explained by Europeans. It was a state of immense administrative intelligence. The Incas built roads through terrain that punished every mistake. They moved armies without horses or wheeled transport. They organized labor across ecological zones. They transformed agriculture with terraces, irrigation, storage systems, and state planning. They controlled populations through resettlement, tribute labor, religious authority, and political integration. They absorbed conquered peoples not only by force, but by making them part of a larger imperial order. But rapid expansion creates hidden strain. The Inca state had conquered many peoples in a short time. Some accepted the empire because it offered order, security, food redistribution, and prestige. Others obeyed because refusal was dangerous. Local elites were incorporated, but not always willingly. Communities could remember independence. Recently conquered groups could hate Cusco while serving it. The empire looked enormous from above. From below, it was a landscape of loyalties, resentments, calculations, and fear. This is the first crack in the case. The Inca Empire was powerful, but it was not universally loved. No empire is. And then came a second crack. A succession. Huayna Capac, one of the great Inca rulers, had expanded imperial power and ruled over a vast domain. But around the late 1520s, he died, very likely during the waves of epidemic disease that had moved ahead of the Europeans themselves. Smallpox and other Old World diseases traveled through indigenous networks before many communities had even seen a Spaniard. They killed rulers, nobles, soldiers, farmers, children, and elders. They broke families, disrupted succession, and shook societies that had no prior immunity to them. This is one of the great silent forces behind the Spanish conquest. The invaders did not arrive alone. Disease had already entered the story. After Huayna Capac's death, the empire faced a succession crisis between two of his sons, Huáscar, based in Cusco, and Atahualpa, whose power was rooted in the north, especially around Quito and the armies that had served Huayna Capac there. The conflict became civil war. And civil war is not merely a fight between two claimants. It is a machine that destroys trust. The Inca elite split, armies fought, nobles chose sides, captives were killed, old rivalries sharpened. Atahualpa's generals, including the formidable Chalcuchimac and Quizquiz, defeated Huáscar's forces. Huáscar was captured. Atahualpa emerged victorious, but victory did not heal the empire. It placed him at the top of a state still bleeding internally. This is the moment the Spanish entered the high drama of the Andes. Not into a peaceful empire at full coherence. Not into a collapsed empire without strength, but into a victorious empire still recovering from civil war, with its legitimate order contested, its elites divided, its sacred authority shaken, and its ruler newly triumphant but not yet fully secure. Atahualpa had won the civil war. He had not yet restored the world. Chapter 2: The Men from the Sea. Francisco Pizarro was not young when he reached the decisive moment of his life. He was an experienced, hard-edged, ambitious man from Extremadura, one of those Spanish frontier figures formed by poverty, war, risk, and the brutal opportunities of empire. He had seen what Hernán Cortés had done in Mexico. He knew that small Spanish forces could become devastating if they combined violence, diplomacy, alliances, surprise, and the weaknesses of indigenous political systems. But Peru was not Mexico. The Andes were not the Valley of Mexico. Atahualpa was not Moctezuma. The Inca Empire was not the Aztec Triple Alliance. And yet Pizarro understood one lesson that mattered. The capture of a ruler could transform an impossible military situation. Cortés had seized Moctezuma and Tenochtitlan and used him as a political hostage. That strategy had not guaranteed immediate victory. The Spanish nearly perished during the Noche Triste and only returned through alliance warfare. But it revealed the power of decapitation in a highly centralized political order. Pizarro had far fewer men than any rational conqueror would want. His force in 1532 was tiny, roughly 168 Spaniards with cavalry, infantry, firearms, crossbows, steel weapons, and a few small cannon. The exact composition varies by account, but the essential fact remains astonishing. They were not an army in the imperial sense. They were a violent expedition, a gamble, a blade carried into the body of a continent. Their technological advantages were real, but often misunderstood. Steel swords and armor mattered. Horses mattered enormously, especially psychologically and tactically in a world without cavalry traditions. Firearms and cannon mattered, though early guns were slow, unreliable, and far less decisive than later myth suggests. But technology alone did not conquer the Andes. A few guns cannot defeat an empire by themselves. The Spanish advantage was not only material, it was strategic nerve. It was willingness to take extreme risks. It was experience in violence. It was the ability to exploit division. It was the shock produced by unfamiliar animals, weapons, and tactics. It was the ruthless understanding that if they could not defeat the empire's armies in open war, they might seize the person around whom imperial power revolved. The Spanish marched inland from the coast. Every step was dangerous. They were deep in a world where they had little supply security, little knowledge, and no easy escape. If Atahualpa chose to crush them in the mountains, they could be surrounded, cut off, starved, or overwhelmed. Pizarro knew this. His men knew this. Their courage was inseparable from desperation. Meanwhile, Atahualpa watched them. The Inca ruler was not ignorant of the Spaniards. Reports had reached him. He knew strange foreigners were moving through his realm. He knew they had animals, weapons, and unusual behavior. But knowing that strangers exist is not the same as understanding what kind of threat they represent. To Atahualpa, the Spaniards may have seemed dangerous, but also small, possibly useful, possibly controllable, possibly a curiosity to be examined after his Civil War victory. He had far greater armies nearby. He had just defeated his brother. He was surrounded by the aura of triumph. The idea that this tiny force could threaten the imperial order may have seemed absurd. This was not stupidity. It was misclassification. Atahualpa placed the Spaniards into a category his world already understood. Small foreign group, armed strangers, potential subjects, possible messengers, perhaps troublesome but manageable. Pizarro placed Atahualpa into another category entirely, the key to the empire. The tragedy began when each side thought it understood the meeting. Chapter 3: The Road to Cajamarca. Cajamarca lay in the northern highlands, a town with hot springs, plazas, buildings, and enough space to host a fateful encounter. Atahualpa was camped nearby with a large force, probably numbering in the tens of thousands. Exact figures in conquest narratives always require caution, but the imbalance was not in question. He had overwhelming manpower. The Spanish entered Cajamarca and found the town largely empty. This must have deepened their fear. They were not entering a bustling settlement where negotiation could be hidden inside normal life. They were entering a stage prepared by absence. The Inca army was nearby. The Spaniards were alone in the town. They could feel the trap around themselves, even as they prepared one of their own. Pizarro arranged his men around the plaza. Cavalry hidden. Infantry ready. Weapons prepared. The plan was insane unless it worked perfectly. They would invite Atahualpa into the town. They would let him enter the plaza. Then they would strike. The goal was not to win a battle against the Inca army. The goal was to seize Atahualpa before the army could understand what had happened. This is where the Spanish gamble becomes almost impossible to overstate. If Atahualpa entered with armed soldiers in battle formation, the ambush might fail. If the Inca forces reacted quickly, the Spaniards could be surrounded. If Atahualpa stayed outside the town and ordered an attack, Pizarro's force might be crushed. If the Spanish killed Atahualpa by accident before securing him, they might lose the only hostage that could protect them. Everything depended on shock, and Atahualpa gave them the opportunity. He agreed to come. On November 16, 1532, he entered Cajamarca in ceremonial splendor. He did not arrive as a man expecting battle. He arrived carried in a litter, surrounded by attendants, nobles, and retainers. Many accounts say his immediate entourage was not armed for battle in the way Spanish soldiers were armed. The atmosphere was ritual, not tactical. The Incas came with numbers, dignity, and imperial confidence. The Spaniards waited with terror hidden behind walls. Then came the friar. Vicente de Valverde approached Atahualpa with a cross and a breviary or Bible, accompanied by an interpreter. The exchange that followed has become one of the most famous symbolic moments of the conquest. According to Spanish accounts, Valverde attempted to present Christian doctrine and the authority of the Spanish monarch, demanding submission. Atahualpa asked about the book, handled it, and not understanding its meaning in the Spanish religious framework, threw or dropped it. Then the Spanish attacked. This scene has been told for centuries, as if a book caused an empire to fall. That is too simple. The Spaniards did not launch the ambush because Atahualpa mishandled a Bible. The ambush had already been prepared. The religious confrontation helped provide a signal, a justification, a script of moral authority. But the violence was waiting before the book touched the ground. The Spaniards burst into the plaza. Cannon fired. Horses charged. Steel cut through attendants and nobles. The noise, animals, smoke, and sudden violence created chaos. The Inca entourage, crowded and unprepared for this kind of attack, could not respond effectively. The Spaniards drove toward Atahualpa's litter, killing those who held it up. Men lost hands and arms trying to keep the ruler elevated. Finally, the litter fell or was seized. Atahualpa was captured. The ruler of the Inca Empire was alive. The plaza was filled with death. And the Spanish, who should have been the weakest force in the town, now held the most powerful man in the Andes. Chapter 4: The Shock of the Impossible. The capture of Atahualpa worked because it attacked not simply a man, but a political structure. The Inca ruler, the Sapa Inca, was not an ordinary king in the European sense. He was sacred, central, connected to the sun, surrounded by ritual, kinship, and imperial hierarchy. His body mattered. His presence mattered. His command held together networks of authority across the empire. When the Spanish seized him, they did not automatically control Tawantinsuyu, but they created paralysis at the top. What should Atahualpa's generals do? Attack immediately and risk killing their ruler. Withdraw and lose initiative. Negotiate. Wait for orders from the captive emperor. Continue the civil war settlement. Secure the prisoner Huáscar. Deal with Spanish demands. The empire's strength had become a problem. Its authority was concentrated enough that the ruler's captivity created uncertainty everywhere. This is the central lesson of Cajamarca. A centralized state can move with terrifying efficiency when its center commands freely. But if the center is captured, the same concentration can produce hesitation. Atahualpa himself had reasons to believe he could still manage the situation. He was alive. He retained prestige. He could communicate. He could bargain. The Spaniards were few. They needed him. If he bought time, perhaps he could understand them, manipulate them, or outlast them. He may have believed that the invaders' hunger for precious metal could be used to control them. The Spaniards, meanwhile, needed the empire to obey Atahualpa long enough to enrich and protect them. This created a strange arrangement. Atahualpa was a prisoner, but he was also still a ruler. He could issue commands. Messengers came and went. Nobles visited. The Spanish guarded him while depending on his authority to gather treasure and prevent immediate annihilation. The room where he was kept became the temporary center of two worlds, Inca sovereignty and Spanish greed. Then Atahualpa made the offer that became legend. He would fill a room with gold and twice with silver in exchange for his freedom. The ransom room became one of the most powerful images of the conquest. Objects from temples, palaces, and storehouses were brought to Cajamarca. Gold and silver ornaments, vessels, plaques, and sacred or royal treasures were melted down by the Spanish into bullion. The artistry, religious meaning, and political symbolism of those objects mattered little to men calculating shares. This was not only looting. It was translation by destruction. Inca sacred and royal objects were transformed into Spanish wealth. Meaning became metal. Metal became reward. Reward became loyalty among the conquerors. The ransom bought time. It did not buy freedom. Chapter 5: The Brother Who Had to Die. Atahualpa's captivity did not freeze the empire's other crisis. Huáscar, his defeated brother and rival, was still alive at first. That was dangerous. If the Spanish realized Huáscar could be useful, they might replace Atahualpa with him. A captive ruler is valuable only if no better captive exists. Atahualpa understood this. The Spanish might not fully grasp the imperial succession immediately, but they were learning quickly that Andean politics had divisions they could exploit. Huáscar was killed, while Atahualpa was in captivity. The exact chain of command and responsibility has been discussed, but the broad interpretation is clear. Atahualpa had powerful motives to remove his brother as an alternative claimant. The civil war did not end because the Spaniards arrived. It continued inside the conquest. This is one of the darkest ironies. Atahualpa had won the empire, but in the process he had helped weaken the unity he needed to resist the Spanish. The killing of Huáscar may have protected Atahualpa's claim in the short term, but it also deepened the legitimacy crisis. Supporters of Huáscar had no reason to die for Atahualpa. Some Andean elites and communities saw the Spaniards not only as invaders, but as possible tools against the victorious northern faction. Again, conquest becomes collaboration. The Spanish did not understand everything about Inca politics, but they understood enough. Rival claimants are useful. Discontented elites are useful. A civil war leaves wounds that can be opened. Atahualpa, trapped in Cajamarca, was still trying to play imperial politics. Pizarro was learning how to play them too. The ransom continued to arrive. The Spaniards became richer than many of them could have imagined. But wealth created a new question. What happens when the room is full? If the Spanish honored the agreement and released Atahualpa, what then? Would he gather his armies and destroy them? Would he keep his promises? Would he become a puppet? Would he escape their control? Would his generals attack? The Spaniards had captured the emperor, but they could not keep him forever without making a decision. A living Atahualpa was valuable as long as he helped them. He was terrifying once he might become free. The ransom room had solved their greed. It had not solved their fear. Chapter 6: The Trial of the Captive Emperor. The Spanish eventually put Atahualpa on trial. The proceeding was a grotesque performance of legality under conditions of conquest. The charges included rebellion, idolatry, polygamy, fratricide, and plotting against the Spaniards. Some charges reflected Spanish religious and moral frameworks imposed on an Andean ruler. Some related to real political violence, including the killing of Huáscar. Some were shaped by fear that Atahualpa was secretly ordering forces against the invaders. But the deeper question was not legal. It was practical. Could the Spaniards afford to keep him alive? Pizarro and his men were divided. Some may have wanted to preserve Atahualpa as a useful puppet. Others feared him. The arrival of Diego de Almagro and more Spaniards increased tensions over treasure and strategy. The conquistadors were not a unified moral body. They were a coalition of armed opportunists under pressure, with greed, fear, rivalry, and ambition all pressing on the decision. Atahualpa was sentenced to death. The original sentence was burning, a punishment with terrifying spiritual implications in the Christian framework, because it threatened the body's integrity. Atahualpa agreed to baptism and was executed by strangulation instead, taking the Christian name Francisco. The last independent, victorious Inca ruler was killed by the men who had accepted his ransom. This is one of the clearest betrayals in the file. Atahualpa had paid. The Spaniards had promised. Then they killed him. Defenders of the Spanish decision later argued that Atahualpa remained dangerous, that he had plotted rebellion, that he had killed his brother, that keeping him alive could doom the expedition. Those fears were not imaginary. A released Atahualpa might well have tried to destroy the Spaniards. But fear does not erase betrayal. The Spanish had turned negotiation into extraction, extraction into judgment, and judgment into execution. They did not merely kill a ruler. They announced that Spanish promises were subordinate to Spanish survival and ambition. The death of Atahualpa did not end Inca resistance, but it removed the one figure whose captivity had held the immediate political world in suspension. Now, the Spaniards needed a new strategy. They would not rule the Andes by force alone. They would rule through claimants, through factions, through puppet rulers, through alliances with those who hated Atahualpa's line or saw advantage in Spanish support. The conquest did not end at Cajamarca. It became more complicated. Chapter 7: Cusco and the Politics of Puppets. After Atahualpa's death, the Spaniards moved toward Cusco, the imperial capital. But they did not march through an empty political landscape. They used Inca divisions. They elevated a new ruler, Tupac Hualpa, a son of Huayna Capac and a rival to Atahualpa's faction. When he died, they later supported Manco Inca, another royal figure, who initially cooperated with them. This was not accidental. The Spanish understood that legitimacy mattered. They did not simply abolish the Inca political order on day one. They tried to inhabit it, manipulate it, and redirect it. A puppet ruler could command obedience in ways Spaniards could not. A royal name could open doors. Local elites might accept a recognized Inca more easily than a foreign soldier. Cusco fell to the Spaniards in 1533. The symbolic importance was enormous. The old imperial capital, sacred and political heart of the Inca world, entered Spanish hands. Temples, palaces, and storehouses became sources of wealth. The Spanish saw gold and silver. The Andean world saw sacred spaces violated and old authority transformed. But again, conquest was not completion. Manco Inca eventually rebelled. In 1536, he launched a massive uprising against the Spaniards, besieging Cusco and threatening the fragile Spanish position. This rebellion reminds us that the Inca Empire did not simply collapse because Atahualpa died. Resistance continued. The Spanish came close to disaster. The Andean world still possessed enormous military capacity and political will. Yet the Spanish survived. Why? Because by then they were not alone. They had indigenous allies. They had exploited divisions. They had horses, steel, fortifications, and experience. They had learned the terrain of Andean politics. They benefited from rivalries and resentments inside the world the Incas had built through conquest. The empire's own expansion had created enemies who did not necessarily see the return of Cusco's power as liberation. This is a hard truth. Spanish conquest depended heavily on indigenous participation. Not because indigenous allies were foolish. Often they were making rational choices in a brutal political environment. Many communities had suffered under Inca rule. Some saw the Spaniards as temporary allies against Cusco. Some hoped to improve their local position. Some had little choice. Some misjudged Spanish long-term intentions. Some understood the danger but chose the lesser immediate threat. The tragedy is that local calculations helped create a larger domination. This does not make Spanish conquest less violent or less responsible. It makes it historically real. Empires often fall when those they have conquered choose not to save them. Chapter 8: Why the Empire did not strike first. One of the most haunting questions in this case is simple. Why did Atahualpa not destroy the Spaniards before Cajamarca? He had the numbers. He had the territory. He had the army. The answer is not that he was stupid. The answer lies in perception, politics, and timing. First, the Spaniards were few. Their very smallness made them seem less threatening than they were. A massive army does not always treat a tiny force as existential. Atahualpa may have believed he could observe, intimidate, absorb, or eliminate them later. Second, Atahualpa had just emerged from civil war. His immediate political concerns were not only foreign invaders. He had to consolidate power, deal with Huáscar's supporters, manage generals, and transform military victory into imperial stability. The Spaniards entered his world at a moment when his attention was divided. Third, the Spanish threat was unfamiliar. Horses, firearms, steel, and European tactics created shock. But before Cajamarca, the Inca could not fully know how the Spaniards would use them in a confined ambush. The Spaniards were not simply another Andean enemy. They operated with different assumptions about diplomacy, hostage-taking, violence, and sacred authority. Fourth, Andean political culture shaped the encounter. Atahualpa came as a ruler receiving strangers, not as a commander launching immediate annihilation. The meeting had ritual and diplomatic dimensions. He may have expected submission, tribute, explanation, or display. Pizarro expected a hostage. Fifth, Atahualpa may have wanted to understand the Spaniards before acting. Killing them immediately might have seemed unnecessary or premature. Capturing or controlling them later may have seemed easy. In hindsight, restraint looks foolish. In the moment, it may have looked like confidence. That is why the disaster is so powerful. Atahualpa's error was not that he underestimated danger in the abstract. It was that he misread the kind of danger in front of him. He saw a small group. He did not see a method. Chapter 9: The Spanish Advantage No One Could Count. The numbers at Cajamarca are so extreme that they almost obscure the real Spanish advantage. Yes, the Spaniards had horses, steel, guns, and armor. But their greatest advantage may have been strategic asymmetry. The Incas had much more to lose. The Spaniards had almost no safe retreat. That made them dangerous. Desperation can produce reckless clarity. Pizarro could not win a conventional campaign against the full empire with fewer than 200 men. so he did not try. He gambled everything on the one move that could make the impossible possible. Atahualpa, by contrast, had an empire to manage. He could afford to delay, observe, and judge, or so it seemed. The Spanish also possessed experience from the Caribbean, Panama, and Mexico. They knew that indigenous states could contain rival factions. They knew that rulers could be used as hostages. They knew that Christian legal language could be deployed to justify violence. They knew that treasure could bind their own men to the campaign. They knew that local alliances could multiply their force. The Incas were not less intelligent. They had less experience with this specific type of invader. That difference was decisive. A society can be brilliant inside its own strategic world and still be vulnerable when an outsider violates the expected rules. Pizarro did not come to play Andean diplomacy. He came to break it. Chapter 10: The Ransom Room. The ransom room deserves its own place in the case because it reveals the moral and psychological core of the conquest. Atahualpa promised to fill a room with gold to a certain height and twice with silver. The treasures came from across the empire. Messengers carried orders. Objects arrived. The Spanish watched the room fill. Imagine what that meant. For the Incas, many of these objects were not simply wealth. They could carry sacred, ceremonial, dynastic, or artistic significance. Gold was not money in the European sense. It was associated with the sun, with brilliance, with power, with offerings, with elite and sacred display. Silver had its own meanings. For the Spanish, these meanings collapsed into value by weight. The treasures were melted. The ransom was divided. The king's fifth was set aside. Men who had risked everything became rich. This was the moment when the conquest became materially irreversible for the Spaniards. Too much wealth had appeared. Too many fortunes were now tied to the enterprise. Too many men understood what the Andes could yield. The logic of extraction had taken hold. But the ransom room also reveals Atahualpa's miscalculation. He believed or hoped that Spanish desire could be satisfied. It could not. Gold did not end Spanish ambition. It confirmed it. The room filled with treasure did not make Atahualpa safer. It made the empire look even more worth taking. This is the trap of buying off a predator who has just discovered the location of the herd. Payment can postpone violence. It can also advertise the rewards of more violence. When the room was filled, Atahualpa expected release. The Spaniards saw a prisoner too dangerous to free and an empire too rich to leave. The ransom had proved the wrong thing. Chapter 11: The Trial of Responsibility. If this case were tried before history, the first accused would be Francisco Pizarro. He planned the ambush. He seized Atahualpa. He accepted the ransom. He allowed or approved the execution. He led a conquest built on deception, violence, and exploitation. He was brave, skilled, and bold, but bravery in the service of betrayal does not become innocence. Yet Pizarro alone did not bring down the Inca Empire. Atahualpa must also be examined. He misjudged the Spaniards. He entered Cajamarca in a way that made the ambush possible. He allowed confidence to replace caution. He had just won a civil war, but he had not secured the unity needed to meet a new threat. He killed or caused the death of Huáscar, eliminating one rival but deepening the empire's fracture. His choices mattered. But blaming Atahualpa too heavily risks hindsight. He faced a kind of enemy no Inca ruler had faced before. He did not know that the Spaniards, small numbers, concealed an entire Atlantic system of reinforcement, disease, greed, imperial ambition, and religious justification. He did not know that hostage-taking would be used with such audacity. He could not be expected to understand everything the Spaniards represented. The Inca imperial system itself belongs in the dock. Its centralization made it powerful, but also vulnerable to the capture of the ruler. Its rapid expansion created resentments. Its civil war shattered elite unity. Its politics made legitimacy personal and dynastic at the very moment an external predator arrived. The Spanish crown bears responsibility as the larger legal and imperial framework that authorized, rewarded, and absorbed conquest. Even when conquistadors acted with great autonomy, they operated inside a world that turned their violence into empire. Indigenous rivals and allies also shaped the outcome, though their responsibility is different. Many were themselves navigating oppression, opportunity, and survival under Inca rule and then Spanish intrusion. They were not merely pawns. They made choices, but they did not control the imperial system that Spain would build on their choices. And disease, the invisible invader, must be named. Without epidemic disruption, the succession crisis and demographic devastation would have been very different. Disease weakened the empire before Cajamarca and continued to devastate indigenous societies afterward. It was not a conscious actor, but it was one of the most powerful forces in the conquest. The verdict cannot be simple. Pizarro struck the blow. Atahualpa offered the opening. Civil war weakened the body. Disease shook the foundations. Local resentments widened the cracks. Spanish imperial ambition turned the cracks into conquest. Chapter 12. The fragility of sacred power. The capture of Atahualpa shows a paradox at the heart of monarchy. The more sacred the ruler, the more powerful his presence can be. But the more dangerous his absence becomes. In the Inca Empire, the ruler was not only an administrator. He was a sacred center, a political focus, a dynastic anchor. His authority moved people, armies, goods, and legitimacy. When he was free, this concentration strengthened the state. When he was captured, it created paralysis. The Spaniards did not defeat all Inca armies at Cajamarca. They did not capture all roads. They did not control all provinces. They did not understand all languages, customs, loyalties, or terrain. But they captured the man whose authority could command much of that world. This is why the event feels so disproportionate. A tiny force produced an enormous result because it attacked the system at a point where symbolism and command overlapped. But sacred power also had another weakness. It made misreading easier. Atahualpa had reason to believe that his majesty mattered. In his world, it did. His presence was not mere theater, it was power. When he entered Cajamarca ceremonially, he was not simply being vain, he was performing sovereignty. But Pizarro did not respect the performance. He saw the litter not as sacred authority, but as a target. When two political cultures meet, the deadliest moments often occur when one side treats as sacred what the other treats as tactical. Chapter 13. The Empire after the Emperor. After Atahualpa's death, the Inca world did not end in a single moment. That is important. The conquest was not completed at Cajamarca. It continued through marches, alliances, battles, rebellions, negotiations, betrayals, and decades of resistance. Manco Inca's rebellion nearly destroyed the Spanish position. The Neo-Inca state at Vilcabamba survived for decades after the initial conquest, until the execution of Tupac Amaru in 1572. So we should not imagine the Inca Empire as a glass object that shattered instantly when Atahualpa fell. It was more like a vast body struck in the head, staggering, fighting, bleeding, adapting, and only slowly being forced into a new order. But Cajamarca changed the direction of the struggle. It gave the Spaniards a hostage, treasure, legitimacy through manipulation and time. It allowed them to enter Andean politics not merely as raiders, but as kingmakers. It revealed divisions they could exploit. It gave them wealth to reward soldiers and attract more Spaniards. It proved that the impossible was possible. After Cajamarca, every Andean faction had to recalculate. The Spaniards were no longer strange intruders on the edge of the empire. They were the men who had captured the Inca. That fact had political gravity. Some feared them. Some used them. Some resisted them. Some joined them. But no one could ignore them. Chapter 14. The Myth of Inevitability. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire is often told as if European victory were inevitable. It was not. Pizarro could have been killed before Cajamarca. The ambush could have failed. Atahualpa could have refused the meeting. The Inca army could have attacked immediately after the capture. Spanish reinforcements could have been cut off. Manco Inca's rebellion could have succeeded. Rival Spanish factions could have destroyed each other earlier. Indigenous alliances could have shifted differently. The empire could have adapted faster. History did not have to happen exactly as it did. The belief in inevitability is dangerous because it flatters the winners and excuses the process. It makes conquest look like destiny rather than decisions. It turns betrayal into historical change. It turns greed into expansion. It turns violence into contact. It turns human choices into weather. Cajamarca was not destiny. It was an ambush, a decision, a risk, a misreading, a crime, a success, a disaster. And like many disasters, it became inevitable only after enough people made it so. Chapter 15. What Cajamarca really changed. Cajamarca did not simply change Peru. It changed the history of global empire. The wealth extracted from the Andes would help fuel Spanish imperial power. Silver from the Americas, especially later from Potosi, would move through global networks, affecting Europe, Asia, and the wider world. The conquest of the Inca world became part of a larger transformation, the violent integration of the Americas into an Atlantic and global economy dominated by European empires. But Cajamarca also changed the moral imagination of conquest. It showed that a small group of armed Europeans operating far from home could overthrow vast political orders if they exploited internal division, captured rulers, used technology for shock, and turned local politics into imperial opportunity. This was not a universal formula, and it did not work everywhere in the same way, but it became part of the repertoire of empire. It also left a long memory of betrayal. The meeting in Cajamarca was supposed to be diplomacy. It became a trap. The ransom was supposed to buy freedom. It financed conquest. Baptism was supposed to offer spiritual salvation. It came moments before execution. Every stage of the story contains a broken meaning. That is why the capture of Atahualpa remains so powerful. It is not only that the Inca ruler lost. It is that the rules of his world were violated by men playing a different and more ruthless game. Chapter 16, The Last Question. Could Atahualpa have saved the empire? Perhaps, if he had destroyed the Spaniards before Cajamarca, if he had entered the town with armed troops ready for battle, if he had refused the meeting, if the civil war had not happened, if Huáscar and Atahualpa had not divided the elite, if disease had not weakened the dynasty, if local peoples had rallied unanimously behind Inca authority. But these are the questions history leaves behind after the door has closed. Atahualpa did not have the privilege of hindsight. He had reports, rituals, assumptions, rivals, recent victory, unfamiliar enemies, and a world he believed he understood. Pizarro had fewer men, but he had a clearer, immediate objective: capture the ruler. Everything else would follow if that worked. That clarity was brutal. And in the plaza at Cajamarca, brutality defeated majesty. The deeper lesson is not that small armies always beat large empires. They do not. The lesson is that empires are most vulnerable where they are most certain of themselves. Atahualpa came to Cajamarca as the center of a world. Pizarro saw only the center of a target. The capture of Atahualpa is one of history's most disturbing turning points because it compresses an imperial disaster into a single afternoon. The Inca Empire was not weak in any simple sense. It had roads, armies, storehouses, administrators, sacred authority, and a political imagination capable of organizing life across some of the hardest terrain on Earth. But it arrived at Cajamarca wounded by civil war, shaken by disease, divided by recent conquest, and led by a ruler who misread a tiny foreign force as something his world could contain. Pizarro's genius, if we can use that word for something so ruthless, was understanding that he did not need to defeat the empire first. He needed to seize the man through whom the empire understood command. And that is why this case still matters. Great powers often fear the enemy that looks equal: the rival army, the competing empire, the obvious threat at the border. But sometimes the fatal danger looks too small to deserve immediate destruction. It arrives as a delegation, a curiosity, a manageable problem. Then it strikes the one point where power, legitimacy, and symbolism meet. So what is your verdict? Was Atahualpa doomed by Spanish treachery, Inca civil war, imperial centralization, disease, or the fatal confidence of a ruler who had just won everything except the future? Leave your answer in the comments and subscribe to the History Docket as we continue reopening the disasters where history turned not on the size of an army, but on the meaning of a single decision.